Hello, you're watching the Great Canadian Bagel here, and today we have another episode of the Understanding Politics series. This time, what is reactionism? Now, before I begin, I would like to once again shout out all my channel members and thank you guys for everything you do for the channel. Your support really helps pay the bills and do everything I'm doing. So thank you for that, and if you want to support the channel, by all means go down below and join. And if you can't afford to do that, I understand. By all means, just do like, share, subscribe, all your regular YouTube things. But with no further ado, let us begin. So, reaction is an interesting concept in politics and political philosophy. It's borderline if we should even really call it a philosophy. Unlike other ideologies or things like, say, liberalism, which is a rationalist construct, or conservatism, which is more of like a principle, reactionism is essentially an anti-ideology. It actually makes no concrete claims about the world. It has no grand plan. Instead, it's really just the personification of disgust in a political movement. The total revulsion towards a change in the status quo. Reactionism occurs when there is a great change in the status quo in any direction, be it left, right, up, down, or anything in between. And all it serves to do is slow down or try to reverse that change. Now, historically, it's never been very effective at that because there is no coherency behind it. There is no structure, there is no order behind it. And without the structure, without the order, without the logic, it's very difficult to organize a political force, which has really been the problem that's plagued reactionism since time immemorial. In the last video in this series, I described how conservatism, as it is known today, was created by the reaction to liberalism. Now, this should not be confused with being reactionary or a type of reactionism. There is a very important difference between that. Something that is a reaction to something, but then creates a coherent, solid, organized worldview that makes sense. Even if you disagree with it, that's no longer reactionism. Reactionism is just anti the status or the change. The easiest definition of reactionism is the status quo ante. In other words, it wants to go back to the previous status quo. The current change is bad, the last status quo is good, and that's all reactionism is. There's many variations of it, which we'll get into, but that's all it is. So, just to reiterate that in a different way, the principal difference between, say, conservatism and reactionism, because oftentimes they're conflated incorrectly, is conservatism crystallized into a coherent philosophy in a way that it can solve new problems in the future. You can give a conservative a new problem, say a modern problem, the housing crisis is too bad. People can't afford houses. Conservatism, the conservative framework, can create solutions to that. A reactionary framework can't, because a reactionary framework is just anti the change, but there hasn't actually been a major change anytime recently, in such that any reactionary movement that would exist, it would be old enough that it's almost barely even really a reaction anymore. There is like a certain time bias to reactionism. If too many changes have happened since that reactionism has occurred, it's no longer very useful. Now, historically, reactionary ideologies have often syncretized with other contemporary ideologies. Usually the ideology best describes to what the status quo ante was. In a sense, the wish to revert to the status quo ante is, again, the essence of reactionism, and that's all it wants to do. It doesn't want to do anything else. It wants to revert society from the most recent change that has happened, and which is why it is a very local and very short-sighted, short lifespan ideology. At a certain point, it's no longer relevant. An example of this is, in practice, the earliest iteration of reactionism is in the 19th century. Reactionaries were the ancient regime loyalists who wanted to undo everything caused by the French Revolution, often allied or syncretized with conservatism. Now, they allied or syncretized with conservatism because conservatism was distinct from liberalism and represented, in a lot of ways, what the status quo was prior to the French Revolution. However, unlike conservatism, the reactionaries didn't have new plans forward. They had no way to adapt to the current environment. They just wanted to undo what has occurred. But the biggest and most important adage about politics is you can't really just undo what has happened. It's happened now. That cat is out of the bag. You cannot put it back in the bag. You can adapt to it and you can change to it, but you can't undo it. It's not a thing that can happen. You can change people's opinions, you can push back against it, you can argue against it, but you can't do a full hard reset, which is, again, why this difference exists. A more recent example, though, would be the reactionaries in the 1980s Soviet Union and contemporary Russia. These reactionaries are pro-communist forces, and a lot of Eastern European countries have very similar kind of reactionary communist parties. And they're reactionary communists because the communists were the previous status quo in Russia. Before the Putin regime, before Gorbachev, traditional communism, if you will even say such a term exists, was the norm in the Soviet Union. The Brezhnev-era communism, if you will. So when Gorbachev tries to relax that, it creates this reactionary movement who doesn't want to see the communist system changed. They like how the system works. They benefit from how the system works. They don't want it to be changed. They're hardcore communists who don't want liberalization at all, period, end of story. So then they oppose Gorbachev's reforms. And that's how you get their coup and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, etc., etc. But that's kind of out of the scope of the video. And then a more modern example, we have what I would call, I think the most recent form of reactionism, is the red pill or manosphere types, such as Andrew Tate, who in all senses of the term are best described as a pre-iPhone liberal reactionary. Their opposition to the present day is just a reactionary disgust to modern progressivism. They don't seek to change anything about the status quo, they just want to undo progressivism. And that's it. Which is how they can sort of be seemingly aligned with the right or conservatives today, because the conservatives also are against progressivism by nature. But there is a very fundamental difference to this, because the conservatives want to change the status quo affirmatively, whereas the red pill or pre-iPhone liberal reactionaries just want to undo what has happened, whereas the conservatives want to progress in a different manner, which might sound weird that the conservatives want to progress, but to a conservative worldview, that makes sense. But that's out of scope for this video. Comment below if you actually want details on that. I might break into it at some point, though. The schedule is not that flexible, so we'll see. Just comment below if you really want that, though, and I'll put it on the to-do list. Now, whereas conservatism was difficult to talk about in general, since it's grounded heavily in religion, reactionism is literally impossible to talk about in general, since its only defining trait is the desire to return to the status quo ante, a relative term, and a term that cannot be grounded or defined in any other way. For the rest of this video, we're going to focus on two examples of reactionism as illustrative examples. There are more than just those two, but those two represent a good coverage of bases. The first case study is the anti-liberal reactionaries, principally dominated during the 19th century. As I stated earlier, this initial form of reactionism was born out of the strife of the French Revolution and saw the carnage and social upheaval and wanted to avert it entirely. They saw the revolution as breaking the communal bonds that held society together, and the hyper-focus on individualism and liberty and rights was an anathema to them. To these types of people, they saw society should be structured, rigidly hierarchical, in a kind of feudal manner, a manorial system, if you will. They were kind of like if you remember the video about absolutism, what is absolutism? They were the people who adhered to that system. They liked that system. And everything about the French Revolution was destroying and rejecting that system and changing it fundamentally from the ground up. Things like the monarchy, gone. We're now a republic. Things like duty and obligations to other people, wiped out. We're all equal now. There is no hierarchy. Things like manorial privileges or rigid social classes, gone. Clericalism, gone. All of these things were wiped out in the span of 20, 30 years in France, and a lot of other countries affected by this. And now, to a certain extent, because of the Revolutionary Wars, these reactionaries got a little bit of a win. They weren't an entirely lost sense because, as a nature of fighting a war, they managed to win the war, and since they won the war, they could use their force of arms to do what they wanted. But in the end, though, even though they won the Napoleonic Wars, and even though they did revert most of what Napoleon and the French revolutionaries did, at the end of the day, those ideas, those beliefs, those values had been unleashed, and until they had worked their way through the populace, which would take many years, possibly centuries, they weren't going to go away, and eventually you see 1848 again pop up, and this kind of ends the first version of reactionism. These reactionaries had hoped to restore Europe to the status quo ante of the absolute monarchies of, say, the Ancien regime. But by 1848, that was gone. And that really the last gasp of the initial version of reactionism petered out. Lasted probably, you could say, 50 years, if we're generous, which is a good clip for reactionism, but it was pretty haggard near the end, and it only lasted so long because the Napoleonic Wars allowed it to persist as long as it did, because they won the war. The second case study we have here is the modern red pill types, who've come to prominence in the last 5 or so years. So this form of reactionism was born out of the confluence of Gamergate, Me Too, and progressive feminism. And when I say by progressive feminism, I really mean the last 10, 15 years of feminism. Some have called it the fourth wave feminism. I don't know if that's the best way to describe it, but I don't really think it matters that much. For the purpose of the video, we're really talking about the last 10, 15 years. So we're talking about the feminist movement's full-scale embrace of, say, things like sex work, or their complete rejection of things like, quote-unquote, sexualization of women, their embrace of, quote-unquote, trans rights and LGBT in general, etc., etc. Their embrace of all that and all this stuff, that is what propelled the modern red pill types, because they did not like those things. More accurately, I think more succinctly, is they don't like how it changed the dynamic between men and women that existed pre-social media, really. So in the early 2000s and the 90s, what you really had was a situation where men and women would have casual hookups, hookup culture, if you will. You would have overtly sexualized women in all sorts of media. You'd have widespread access to pornography and all of these things. And this led to a situation where a lot of men, primarily, because the red pill movement is mostly men, got really used to the idea that they could get used to this existence with women. But feminism evolved to the point that it saw a lot of these things as bad. It did not like the overt sexualization of women, did not like porn, did not like casual hookups. But then feminism kind of went a little wonky on this, and it started going a little incoherent, and this incoherence is why this reactionism popped up. The incoherence specifically is a lot of feminist movement types moved to supporting things like sex work and women going into porn as like an empowerment thing, but then also tried to defeminize media. So you saw an easy example of this with superhero movies, where in the Marvel movies, Black Widow went from being quite sexually dressed woman in the early movies to her final movie where she's all the sexiness of her outfit and of her costume is gone. And that's the kind of archetypical example of this kind of change. And this change, combined with the seemingly incoherent acceptance of sex work at the same time, is what caused this to come forward. And that's kind of what this Gamergate, Me Too, progressive feminism confluence really is. That's what that represents. So a lot of these men are seeing that feminists and other associated allied groups are saying, oh yeah, it's perfectly fine for women to go out and sleep with as many men as they want, but then men aren't allowed to enjoy seeing naked pictures of women or allowed to see provocative pictures of women. And that's where you see people like Richard Haney or other people on Twitter talking about Sydney Sweeney today as quote-unquote anti-woke, despite her having done nothing in and of herself that should be anti-woke. It's literally just that she is willing to be in public provocatively dressed. That she's willing to go into shows provocatively dressed, in movies provocatively dressed. That's all that is. If you don't think about it too much, that seems strange. But at the core essence, it makes sense because this type of reaction isn't a coherent worldview. It is just a rejection of what this change was. They don't want to see the logical progression of this change. They don't want to progress it further into a more proper setting, a more balanced situation, perhaps where you don't lionize sex work, but you also don't completely defeminize media. There might be a balance between completely defeminized media and overly sexualized. Might be a balance there. But we see this kind of thing pop up, and that's kind of what this whole red pill thing boils down to. It's this rejection of modern progressivism, but it's a reactionary liberal perspective. It has no desire or impetus to change, to fix the societal things that has caused this shift in progressives. It just rejects this shift at all, wholesale. It doesn't like it. It wants nothing to change. Which is why you also kind of get these memes popping up. You're in the center, and then the left ran away, and the left ran away even further and dragging the center, and then now you're on the right kind of thing. That's where that comes from. People sharing that as I am the centrist guy are actually just pre-iPhone liberal reactionaries. They might not be the exact same type of reactionary as these red pill types I just described, but they're very similar in sense. They might not be as specifically upset about the sex work, or might be as specifically upset about defeminization of media, but they are upset about the changes progressivism has changed to the liberal status quo. And these types, this kind of liberal who's been dragged to the right, i.e. the liberal reactionary, like all other reactionaries, are a defeatist group because they have no plans. But with that, I'll wrap this up. There's not going to be any overview of different branching ideologies on this one. There's going to be no taxonomy involved. You can't taxonomize this. This reactionaries and reactionism is not taxonomicable because it's not coherent. It is a disgust reaction. But if you like the video, by all means, like, share, and subscribe, comment below, and let me know if you like this. If you like the style, this one's a bit shorter. Do you want these to be this short? Let me know. But with that, I bid you adieu.